And then Disney became so successful with these short cartoons that he thought, well, what else can we do with cartoons? And he made the first full-length feature film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, 1937, in the midst of a Great Depression. And they're the Seven Dwarfs. This is obviously when Snow White is, I think, had a bite of the poisoned apple, I think it is, and it falls into a sleep to be awakened by her prince. So Disney went on and made many other full-length cartoons, which are classics. The company had a habit of re-releasing them to theaters every generation. And just think of Bambi. Gosh, I'm going to forget some of them. Oh my goodness. Sleeping Beauty. Okay. All right. At least I had two more there. And kept on making cartoons and is still making animated films. This is Pixar. Showing Pixar here just to move the animation story ahead. This is computer animation developed by Pixar, a company in which Steve Jobs from Apple Computer, he was a major investor in Pixar, and the company was founded and run by a guy named John Lasseter, and this was the first Toy Story. There have been at least two others, sequels that have also done very well at the box office. This is 1995, and this computer-generated animation has basically replaced almost all the hand-drawn animation that we saw for many, many years with Disney and other animators. Speaking of other animators, this is Warner Brothers' version of hand-drawn animation, and this is their character Bugs Bunny, kind of their leading character. "What's up, Doc?" was his line, and they called their animation division sort of jokingly, at least to the public, Looney Tunes, and we had Elmer Fudd and Daffy Duck, and some great characters there, with an interesting, wacky kind of sense of humor. Not like the Disney studios, which were kind of straight ahead, sentimental, all-American stories. These all had a cheeky sense of humor, I think it's fair to say. And then jumping way ahead, actually back to mostly hand-drawn animation, one of my favorite films of all time, produced by Studio Ghibli, Ghibli, in Japan. And this masterpiece, Spirited Away, was directed and in large part animated by Hideo Miyazaki, who's worked for Studio Ghibli for many, many years. This was came out in 2001. The English worldwide box office almost $400 million. Pixar was in charge of the American version. They hired English actors to do the voices, the voiceover, the dub, I should say. And this film won Best Animated Feature at the 2003 Oscars. Miyazaki has done other wonderful films, like Princess Mononoke, which I took my daughter to see for the first time when she was about 3 years old, and others. So animation, mostly computer-generated with a few exceptions, such as this brilliant work by Studio Ghibli. All right, and now another sensitive area that I want to get into. We already have gotten into it a bit with our discussion of blackface. And I'm going to be showing a picture of blackface again, not a video, just a quick picture. And I'm hoping that I've said enough of the context here that these stereotypes, not just for African Americans, but for other ethnic backgrounds, for both genders. There are all kinds of stereotypes that are reinforced by Hollywood, including, by the way back at the beginning of this lecture, we looked at James Bond, the James Bond film, with the tussle between Sean Connery playing James Bond and Honor Blackman playing, quote, pussy galore, unquote. There's lots of stereotypes generated in Hollywood. Some of those things starting to come around now. So we'll look at some of that evolution and talk about it now. Because is it an important factor? Because movies move us. We listen. We watch. It has an impact on us. So here is very clear and, as I've said before, deplorable depiction by all those white people wearing blackface. Here's another one that might surprise you. Breakfast at Tiffany's was a novel by Truman Capote, who's probably most famous for writing In Cold Blood, which was a true crime novel, really, which was a massive bestseller for him. This is movies based on another shorter book he wrote, and the movie came out in 1961. It's about a young woman living alone in New York, and the characters she deals with, etc., etc. And one of the other residents of her apartment building is this fellow, Mr. Yunioshi. This is a Japanese man, and he is played in this film by Mickey Rooney, who was very far from being Japanese, in kind of goofy makeup with goofy teeth, as you can see here, and the whole thing is basically just a goofy caricature of what it's like to be Japanese or Japanese American. So there's some Asian stereotyping, and I'm sure if we put our minds to it, we can think of lots of other examples of Asian stereotypes which are wrong, just not accurate, being perpetuated in the movies. I've got to say a word about Native American stereotypes. Native Americans have been depicted in films almost from the beginning, because some of the early silent movies were westerns. And often the parts, just as Mickey Rooney is playing a Japanese man, a white man playing a Japanese man, an Asian man. Here we have an actor who was white named Jeff Chandler playing a Native American chief, a famous chief named Cochise, and this is in a film called Broken Arrow, which came out in 1950. And even though the character's played by a white man, at least there's some intelligence and leadership, and it's quote, a good part, unquote. This hasn't always been the case with how Native Americans, indigenous Americans have been depicted in films. And again, we can all think back to, examples of inaccurate and silly depictions of Native Americans. And of course, here we have, this is the actress Theresa Russell, and I just looked for kind of I looked up pictures of hooker parts, okay, to be honest with you, prostitute parts, and there are so many films. One of the parts for a woman, written by men, of course, pretty much 100% of the time, is a prostitute. So, again, stereotypes, inaccurate, unfair stereotypes, not just based on background and where you come from, but also based on your gender. So remember this, communication occurs when, this is our simple model for communication that we started this course with. And so the medium is film, movies. We're the receivers, so there are lots of us sitting there in the audience watching this larger-than-life picture with this great sound. Who is sending this message? Well, normally there are writers, of course, of films. Often there's more than one writer, as something is sort of hammered together. But ultimately the director is the person who's in charge of what happens, of interpreting the script, of casting the script. So it's a team effort, producer, writer, director. Sometimes even the actors, if they're a big enough star, have an influence on what happens in the film and how things are done, how characters are dressed, how they're shown. I would say the director is kind of above everybody else, but it is a team effort. I mean, a script has to be written, the character has to be written a certain way to begin with. In terms of these stereotypes, I'd say it's probably the writers. Here's one for us to think about, because I think what we'll see is the way these stereotypes have started to be corrected is that instead of white men producing, writing, and directing everything in film, or 90% of all films, we've had some other groups, some other people with different backgrounds and different genders starting to be more in charge of what's going on with films. Now, I'm not going to say there's have never been female directors for the last 80 years. There have been, even way back 30, 40, 50 years ago. But for the most part, again, it's white men. But here's another example of this. This is the film of The Color Purple, based on a book by Alice Walkers. It was a Pulitzer Prize. Remember the Pulitzer Prizes? This was for fiction, The Color Purple, and starring Whoopi Goldberg. Oprah has a very big part in this. Almost really came to national prominence, I would say, with her fabulous performance in this film. Quincy Jones, fabulous black record producer, responsible for the music, but the director is Steven Spielberg. So, a white man. So, here we've got a white man interpreting the vision of a black author, and how do we feel about that? How do you feel about that? I think most people agree that it's a very good film, like most of Steven Spielberg's films, but there's something missing. Question for us to think about. So there are more African American, female, Asian, etc. writers, directors, producers. Here's some pretty famous directors. Ava DuVernay, the lower left, is doing some great films, getting some real power in Hollywood. Spike Lee, over there with the hat and the glasses, the black hat, in the upper left, has been around for a while, doing some very cool films. For a while, I'm talking like at least 30 years. So Jordan Peele, with some great films more recently, and some hit box office films, The Others, etc. Greta Gerwig directing Lady Bird. So here's some top folks, some other top female directors. The one, and I'm just being a dummy because I just right now don't remember her name. Let me stop and look up her name, and then, I'm so sorry guys. So the woman on the right there with the blue background is Catherine Bigelow. She directed the film The Hurt Locker about war in Iraq, and won Best Director. And that year, and by the way, she is a former wife of James Cameron, a very famous white male director. So we are seeing more power, and the fact that the writers and the directors and the people who are on the source side are changing and becoming more diverse is moving us away from these stereotypes. Melvin Van Peebles just passed away at the age of 89. If you Google him and look him up, and look up his obituary, for instance, in the New York Times, which we all have subscriptions to for free through FIT, this is an amazing guy. Let me stop here and pick up in a minute.